I need to tell this exactly how it happened because I've told it to friends before, and every time I leave something out or soften a detail to make it easier to say out loud. I'm not doing that here. You're getting the full thing. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that in August of 2021, I drove 4.5 hours into the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas to spend 3 nights alone. I had just ended a 5-year relationship. I wasn't doing well, I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating right. A buddy of mine told me to go sit in the woods for a few days and reset. He said nature has a way of putting things back where they belong. So I loaded my truck with a tent and a cooler and a camp stove, and I drove until the road turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to nothing. The spot I picked was technically a dispersed camping area, which means there are no designated sites. You just pull off wherever the ground is flat enough and set up. I found a clearing about 200 yards from the road next to a creek bed that had mostly dried up. The trees were dense enough that you couldn't see the road from the camp, and you couldn't see the camp from the road. That's what I wanted. Total isolation, no cell signal, no people, just me and whatever was left of my sanity. I set up the tent and got a fire going before sunset. I cooked a can of chili and drank 2 beers and sat there watching the flames until the sky went black. The kind of black you only get when there isn't a single artificial light source for miles. I remember thinking this is exactly what I needed. I fell asleep in my tent around 10 with the rain fly open so I could see the stars through the mesh ceiling. I slept hard for the first time in weeks. I woke up at something past 2 in the morning, not because of a sound, because of a smell, smoke. Not my campfire smoke. That had burned down to coals hours ago. This was different, thicker, chemical almost, like something synthetic burning, plastic or rubber. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was warm and still, and that smell was heavy in it. I stood there barefoot on the pine needles, scanning the tree line with my headlamp. The beam only reached about 40 feet before the darkness swallowed it. I turned in a slow circle. Nothing. I pointed the light toward the dried creek bed and followed it to the left. That's when I saw the glow. About 100 yards downstream through the trees, there was a faint orange light, flickering. Someone else had a fire going. I hadn't seen anyone when I drove in. No other vehicles on the road. No tire tracks in the dirt besides mine. Whoever was out there had either hiked in on foot or had been there before I arrived, and I somehow missed them. The logical thing to do was ignore it and go back to sleep. People camp in national forests all the time, but the smell was wrong. Campfire smoke smells like wood. This didn't. I told myself I'd just walk close enough to see what it was and then come back. I put on my boots and started walking along the creek bed toward the light. The closer I got, the worse the smell became. It went from chemical to something rotten underneath it. Sweet and heavy and wrong. The kind of smell that makes your body react before your brain catches up. My stomach tightened. I slowed down. Through the trees, I could see the source of the light. It was a fire pit, a big one. Someone had dug a wide hole in the ground and built a fire inside it. The flames were low, but the coals were massive. This fire had been burning for hours, maybe all day. Around the pit, there were objects. I couldn't make them out at first. I turned off my headlamp and crouched behind a fallen log. My eyes adjusted. There were clothes, piled up next to the pit, not folded, thrown. A jacket, jeans, a pair of boots, and something else, hanging from a branch above the pit on a piece of wire. It was a wallet, open, dangling over the heat like someone had hung it there on purpose. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I scanned the area around the fire looking for a person, a tent, a vehicle, anything. There was nothing, just the pit and the clothes and the wallet and that terrible smell pouring off the coals. I stayed behind that log for what felt like 10 minutes. My legs were shaking, not from cold, from something I didn't have a word for yet. Then I heard a branch snap. not near the fire, behind me, between me and my camp. I turned around and pointed my headlamp into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees and landed on a man. He was standing about 30 feet away. He wasn't moving. He was just standing between two pines with his arms at his sides, looking directly at me. He was shirtless. His chest and arms were smeared with something dark, dirt or ash or something worse. His face was expressionless, not angry, not surprised, just blank, like he had been standing there for a while, like he had been watching me watch his fire. I want to tell you I ran. I want to tell you I sprinted back to my truck and tore out of there. But my body didn't do that. My body froze. I stood there with my headlamp pointed at this man, and he stood there staring back at me, and neither of us moved. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, I don't know. Then he took one step toward me, just one, slow and deliberate, like he was testing whether I would run. That single step broke whatever was holding me in place. I turned and ran. I didn't follow the creek bed. I ran straight through the trees in the direction I thought my camp was. Branches hit my face and my arms. I tripped twice. The second time I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me, but I got up and kept going. When I reached my camp, I didn't pack anything. I grabbed my keys and my phone from inside the tent and ran to the truck. I started the engine and reversed down the dirt road with my headlights off because I didn't want him to see which direction I went. I didn't turn the lights on until I hit the gravel. I drove to the nearest town, which was 45 minutes away. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station until sunrise, shaking and staring at the road behind me in the mirror. I called the Forest Service that morning and told them what I saw. They said they'd send a ranger to check the area. I gave them the approximate location. I don't know what they found. Nobody called me back. I went back 2 weeks later during the day with my buddy to get my tent and gear. The campsite was untouched, but the fire pit downstream was real. The hole was there, filled with ash and charred debris. The clothes were gone, the wallet was gone, but the wire was still hanging from the branch. And at the bottom of the pit, underneath the ash, my buddy found a belt buckle. It was melted and warped, but you could still make out the shape. I didn't report that. I took a photo of it and left. I've never been back to that forest. I still have the photo. I look at it sometimes and I think about the man standing in the dark with that blank face, and I think about whose clothes those were, and I think about that smell, and I try very hard not to connect those thoughts into the shape they so obviously want to form.
I was 24 and had been backpacking for 3 years at that point. I wasn't new to this. I had done solo trips in the Cascades, in the Sierras, and parts of the Appalachian Trail. I knew how to read a map. I knew how to hang a bear bag. I knew how to stay calm when something went wrong. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that what happened to me in Olympic National Park in September of 2022 was not a case of an inexperienced hiker panicking over nothing. Something was out there with me, something that shouldn't have been. If you're enjoying this video, hit subscribe right now. I'm not kidding when I say the next story is even worse. Also smash that like button, it helps the channel more than you know. Alright, let me tell you about mile 14. I was doing a 3-day solo loop on a trail that cuts through the interior rainforest. The canopy is so thick in there that even at noon, the forest floor is dim. By late afternoon, it's dark enough that you need a headlamp to read a map. The trail was well marked but remote. I saw 2 other hikers the entire first day, and both were heading out as I was heading in. By the time I set up camp on the first night, I hadn't seen another person in over 5 hours. Camp was a flat spot next to a river bend. The sound of the water was loud enough to drown out most of the forest noise, which I usually find comforting. That night, I found it suffocating, like the river was covering up sounds I needed to hear. Around 9, I was lying in my tent reading by headlamp when I heard something move through the brush on the far side of the river. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, not a deer. Deer are light and quick, not a bear. Bears crash through brush. They don't pace. Whatever this was moved with weight and intention. It walked along the riverbank for maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. I turned off my headlamp and lay completely still. For about 2 minutes, there was nothing but the river. Then I heard a whistle, one long note, high-pitched, coming from the exact spot where the footsteps had stopped. It lasted maybe 3 seconds and then cut off. I waited. A minute later, it came again. Same note, same duration, same direction. Then silence. I told myself it was another hiker. Someone camped across the river who was trying to signal their group or scare off an animal. That's what whistles are for in the backcountry. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The whistle didn't sound like a safety whistle. It sounded like a human mouth, like someone pursing their lips and blowing a single sustained note. And they were doing it at 9:30 at night in a part of the forest where I hadn't seen a soul in hours. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, the whistle would come again, always from the same spot. Always the same note. It happened 6 times total over the course of about 2 hours. Then it stopped and didn't come back. By morning, I had convinced myself it was an elk or some kind of bird I wasn't familiar with. I packed up and kept hiking. Mile 14 is where the trail crosses a ridge and drops into a narrow valley. The descent is steep and the switchbacks are tight. I was about halfway down when I noticed something on the trail ahead of me, a footprint, a bare human footprint in the mud. Toes, heel, arch, no shoe, no boot. Just a naked foot. I crouched down and looked at it. It was fresh. The edges were sharp and the mud hadn't dried yet. I looked ahead and saw another one, and another. A line of bare footprints heading down the trail in the same direction I was going. I counted 12 before they veered off the trail to the left and disappeared into the underbrush. I stood there staring at the point where they left the path. The brush was thick, ferns and mossy logs, and the kind of tangled growth that you don't walk through barefoot. Not unless you don't care about your feet, or unless you're not thinking clearly, or unless you're not the kind of thing that needs to think at all. I kept hiking faster now. I wanted to reach the next designated campsite before dark. I made it with about an hour of daylight left. The site was empty. I set up my tent and hung my food and started boiling water for dinner. As the light faded, I kept looking at the tree line. I couldn't help it. My eyes kept drifting to the edge of the forest where the shadows started. I ate quickly and got in my tent. I zipped it shut and lay there with my knife next to me and my bear spray within arm's reach. The river was quieter here. I could hear the forest, branches creaking, things moving in the canopy, an owl somewhere far away, normal sounds. I was almost relaxed when the whistle came. Same note, same pitch. Same duration, but this time it was close. Not across a river, not on the other side of a valley. It was maybe 50 yards away. In the trees, on my side of the trail, I sat up and grabbed the bear spray. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my jaw. The whistle came again, closer. 40 yards maybe. I wanted to call out. I wanted to yell who's there like they do in movies. But every instinct I had was telling me to stay quiet, to not let whatever was out there know exactly where I was, even though my tent was right there in the open. The third whistle was the worst. It was close enough that I could hear the breath behind it, the slight waver at the end as the lungs ran out of air. It was human. I was sure of it now. A person was standing in the dark 50 feet from my tent whistling at me, and they had followed me for over 14 miles. I didn't sleep. I sat upright until sunrise with my hand on the bear spray. The whistle came 4 more times during the night, each time from a slightly different direction, like whoever it was circling my camp. Slowly, patiently. When the sun came up, I packed my gear in under 10 minutes. I practically ran the last 6 miles back to the trailhead. When I got to my car, there was a ranger truck parked nearby. I told the ranger everything. The whistling, the footprints, all of it. He listened carefully and wrote it down. Then he told me something that made my blood go cold. He said I wasn't the first person to report this. He said there had been 3 other complaints over the past 2 months from solo hikers on the same trail. All of them described the same thing. Whistling at night, bare footprints on the trail, the feeling of being followed. He said they had sent people to investigate but never found anyone. No camps, no shelters, no trace of anyone living out there. He said they were considering closing that section of the trail. I asked him if he thought it was dangerous. He looked at me for a long second and said, "I think you should be glad you didn't try to find out."
My wife and I took our 2 kids camping every summer at the same lake in northern Minnesota. We'd been doing it since before the kids were born. It was our thing. Same campground. Same site if we could get it. Site's 22 at the end of the loop closest to the water. The kids loved it. They'd spend all day catching frogs and throwing rocks in the lake. My wife and I would sit in our camp chairs drinking coffee in the morning and wine at night and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist for a few days. It was the best week of every year until 2023. We got to the campground on a Monday afternoon. Sites 22 was available. We set up the tent and the canopy, and the kids immediately ran to the water. Everything was perfect. The first 2 days were exactly what we wanted. Sunny, calm. The campground was about half full. Our neighbors on both sides were friendly. An older couple in a pop-up camper to the left, and a family with teenagers in a big RV to the right. Normal people, normal trip. The third night is when it changed. Around 11, my wife and I were sitting by the fire. The kids were asleep in the tent. The campground was quiet. Most people had turned in. The fire was low, and I was about to put it out when my wife grabbed my arm. She didn't say anything. She just grabbed my arm and squeezed. I looked at her, and she was staring past me toward the tree line behind our site. I turned around. There was a person standing just inside the trees. Not on the path, not walking by. Standing still in the dark between the pines, about 20 feet from the back of our tent, where our children were sleeping. I couldn't see their face, just the shape. Tall, thin, arms at their sides, completely motionless. I stood up slowly. I said, "Hey," loud enough for them to hear, but not loud enough to wake the kids. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. I took a step toward them and said it again. "Hey, can I help you?" Nothing. My wife whispered behind me, asking if she should call somebody. The campground had a host site near the entrance with an emergency number posted. I told her to stay by the fire. I picked up my flashlight from the table and pointed it at the figure. The beam hit them directly. It was a man, older, maybe 50. He was wearing dark clothes and a cap pulled low. His face was partially visible in the light, and his expression was what scared me the most. He wasn't startled. He wasn't embarrassed about being caught standing in the dark behind a stranger's campsite. He looked calm, patient, like he had been waiting and wasn't done yet. I told him he needed to leave. My voice was firm, but my hands were shaking. He stared at me for a few more seconds. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked deeper into the trees. Not toward the path, not toward another campsite, into the forest. I watched the flashlight beam follow him until the trees swallowed him up. I stood there for a long time afterward, listening. The forest gave me nothing back. I didn't tell my wife how scared I was. I told her it was probably a drunk who wandered off from his sight. She didn't believe me, but she let it go. We put out the fire and went to bed. I positioned myself between the tent wall closest to the trees and the kids. I lay there with the flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. Around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps outside the tent, slow, circling. They started at the back of the tent near the trees and moved along the left side toward the front. Then they stopped, right at the tent door. I could see the faint shadow of feet through the bottom of the rainfly. 2 feet, pointed at the entrance, standing there. I held my breath. My wife was asleep. The kids were asleep. I was the only person in that tent who knew someone was standing 6 inches away from us, separated by a 1/4 inch of nylon. The feet didn't move for over a minute. I watched them. I watched the shadow shift slightly as the person adjusted their weight. Then very slowly the zipper on the outer rain fly began to move. Someone was unzipping our tent from the outside. The sound was so quiet it was almost inaudible. A millimeter at a time. Whoever was doing it knew exactly how much noise a zipper makes and was trying to stay below that threshold. I snapped. I lunged at the door and ripped the zipper open from my side and screamed as loud as I could. The figure stumbled backward. I saw his face for half a second in the moonlight. Same man, same cap, same calm expression now broken by surprise. He turned and ran. I chased him for about 15 feet before I stopped. I wasn't going to leave my family alone in that tent. I went back and my wife was awake now, holding both kids. She was terrified. I called 911. Officers arrived in about 20 minutes. They searched the campground and the surrounding woods with flashlights and a K9. They found footprints behind our tent, multiple sets, some from that night and some that looked older, dried mud impressions pressed into the pine needles that had been there for at least a day or two. The officer crouched down and studied them for a long time. Then he stood up and looked at me and said, "These prints suggest someone has been standing in this exact spot on more than one occasion." He didn't say it casually. He said it the way a doctor tells you something is wrong, carefully, like he was choosing his words so I wouldn't fall apart in front of my children. The first 2 nights, when we thought everything was perfect, when we sat by the fire and drank wine and watched the sunset and told each other this was the best trip yet, someone had been standing in the trees behind our tent, 15 feet from where our kids were sleeping, watching us, and we had no idea. The dog tracked a scent from the tree line to a dirt service road about a quarter mile from the campground. There was a vehicle parked there, a white cargo van with no license plates. When the officers approached it, the engine started and the van tore off down the road. They pursued but lost it when it turned onto the highway. No plates meant no way to trace it. The officer who stayed with us told me something before he left that I will never forget. He said in his experience, people who do things like this don't do them once. He said the level of patience it takes to stand outside a family's tent for 3 consecutive nights without acting suggests someone who has done this before and will do it again. He told me to lock my car doors and drive home in the morning, and to call if I remembered any other details. He also said I should consider myself lucky. They never found him. They never identified the van. The campground installed motion-activated lights along the tree line after we reported it, but I don't know if they're still there. We never went back to Site 22. We never went back to that campground at all. My wife doesn't like camping anymore. I don't blame her. The kids ask about it sometimes. They remember the frogs and the lake and the campfire. They don't remember the 3rd night. We never told them. They say, "Can we go camping again?" And we tell them maybe next year. But we both know there won't be a next year, because every time I close my eyes and think about that place, I see those 2 feet standing at the entrance of our tent, and I hear that zipper moving, one tooth at a time, in the dark, while my family slept. And I know that if I had fallen asleep 5 minutes earlier, I would never have heard it. And I don't know what would have happened next, but I know it wouldn't have been nothing. Those were 3 true camping horror stories. If you made it to the end, I genuinely want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me which story you're going to be thinking about tonight. And if you've got your own camping experience that still haunts you, write it in the comments. The most disturbing ones get featured in a future video. Subscribe if you haven't. New stories every week. Share this with someone who's about to go camping. Let them decide if they still want to go. Stay safe out there. And if you hear a whistle in the woods, don't follow it.